dislike money in politics, to dislike Republicans. You know, they kind of come to government all coming out of sometimes the same universities with the same viewpoints on things. And so when they hear the dog whistle, when they hear the President of the United States say these nonprofits are scary things, or when they're up in Wisconsin and they see a prosecutor working on a case into campaign finance violations supposedly by conservatives, they're primed to act. They're already ready and inclined to do it. And I think that that's how you end up with some of these abuses, that they're not as always out and out intentional, but you end up in the same place anyway.
Afterwards airs on Book TV every Saturday at 10 p.m. and again Sunday at 9 p.m. Eastern. And you can watch all previous Afterwards programs on our website, booktv.org. C-SPAN, created by America's cable television companies and brought to you as a public service by your cable or satellite provider.
And now Afterwards on Book TV. Wall Street Journal political columnist Kimberly Strassel discusses her book, Intimidation Game, in which she argues the left is utilizing tactics to usurp the political process.
Kimberly, thanks for doing this.
So thrilled.
This is your first book. It must be pretty exciting to have your first book out, but it's a bit of a candle in darkening times you've lit for us. When you read it, it's pretty compelling. What are the takeaways that you want readers to see?
So I think the point of this book is to say that we have got this new era in politics, and I think it's a very scary one. And it's one that, weirdly, you can't always do this in politics. You can actually trace it to a date. And I would make that date January 21st, 2010. And that was when the Supreme Court issued its Citizens United ruling. Now, if you listen to a lot of people, especially Democrats, they'll say that that was a terrible, terrible day because it let all kinds of special money and influence back into elections. I would argue it was a very scary day for a different reason. Not anything to do with dark money or more money. More money is good for speech, but for another reason, and that was the Democrats had come to rely on a lot of these campaign finance rules and speech rules to just keep their opponents from speaking in elections. And when all that went away and the Supreme Court opened up the gates again for people to speak, they said, okay, if we can't outright bar them, we will do the next best thing. We will threaten, we will harass, we will intimidate, and we will tell them that they will pay a political price if they continue to take part in elections. And, you know, we have conversations about this online, and these were the discussions that were being had right after that, and we saw a big attempt in Congress to immediately do that with some legislation that would have had a retribution effect on companies if they had continued to keep speaking.
So tell the story about the IRS scandal, because I learned more about it from reading your book than I ever knew before.
Well, I'm hopeful that this is the very first telling of what really happened at the IRS, because the IRS is a great example of what I'm talking about here. This book is about how government, the liberals and people on the left are using government to silence free speech. It's very different from the campus wars that we talk about and things like this. And the IRS is an excellent example of this. It's what we know is that we had that 2010 campaign finance ruling. The left was very unhappy about this. We know that Democrats also knew a midterm election was coming up, and the country was very angry over a lot of its policies. It was very worried about political blowback and losing the House, maybe even losing the Senate. And they're also very worried because there are Tea Party groups that have formed and they're pouring into the electoral space. And they're all concerned. So what we see is all through 2010, elected Democrats sending letters to the IRS saying you must do something about all these nonprofits and suggesting that they're all shady and awful. You have the president out on the stump saying, wow, you've got all these groups. We don't even know who funds them. They could be funded by foreign entities. It could be illegal. You know, maybe somebody ought to do something about this, was the general tone of what he was saying. And we have an IRS bureaucracy that had already been having this debate internally, and they ran with it. And they ran with it for partisan and ideological reasons. And they managed to we have all the emails that show all this. We have the emails that show that it was done out of Washington, This was not, the White House to this day says that this was just a few line agents in Cincinnati who didn't understand the law, boneheaded errors. We know that's not true. We have a record of what happened there. Within 24 hours of the first Tea Party case getting segregated out in Cincinnati, it was in Washington, and everything was headed out of Washington ever since that moment. And we know that that it was exposed within the IRS that this was happening a year prior to the fact that they finally fessed up. We know that people did not tell Congress the truth when they were asked about it. The story is there. It just has been waiting for somebody to tell it.
You say in here that Lois Lerner, who was at the key of it, she metaphorically flipped the bird to America.
She did. Look, she ran this from inside of her office. And look, I've never been in Lois Lerner's head. I don't know exactly what motivated. We do know that from her emails that she was a partisan to the left. We know that she also had just very strong she hated money in elections. She didn't like the idea of nonprofits being, even though it's the law of the land, and her job was to follow the law of the land. She personally did not like these rules that allowed these groups to operate out there. And we know she was very aware of the political environment in 2010 and going forward, and everything that was happening outside with the president and his policies and things. So we know this all happened, and yet when it was sort of exposed inside, again, top brass at the IRS just didn't come to Congress to tell them what was happening, even though Congress had been asking if this was happening. They didn't necessarily shut it down. And then when she finally came in to testify in front of Congress, having revealed what had happened in that phony press conference, or that event she was at where she had a question planted so that she could reveal this, she gets called in front of Congress. She takes the fifth and then proceeds to give a long defense of herself, which you're not really supposed to do. If you take the fifth, you're supposed to sit silent. So she has yet never really had to answer any questions from anybody who's been doing any of the investigating.
I couldn't help but wonder, as I was reading what you wrote up, what would happen if John Dingell were the chairman of the Oversight Committee instead of the Republicans? Are the Republicans just not effective at oversight, or why aren't they able to get through the stonewalling and the lying?
So, by the way, they have in some ways done a remarkable job. Like, we do know the basic facts of what happened here. And we know that in part because of guys like Darrell Issa, who ran the Oversight Committee. More important, Jim Jordan, the Ohio congressman who sat with me for a long time for this book. He did yeoman's work in digging out a lot of stuff. But one of the reasons we don't know is, don't forget, everybody's computer crashed. Lois Lerner's emails disappeared, and then when there was a backup copy, some of those disappeared. And, the White House has fought tooth and nail about having to turn over documents from their end that might shed some light on this. Everyone clammed up under sort of attorney-client things and executive privilege things, and there's all kinds of reasons why it's been very difficult. This is not a forthcoming administration. And I think that's been pretty clear in a lot of different ways. But we do have the basic elements of the story.
Well, then you keep reading your book and you see other agencies are weaponized, so to speak, against political adversaries of the president. Talk about the FEC.
Yeah, so the FEC, Federal Election Commission, it is a body that was created after Watergate, and it's supposed to be bipartisan. Unlike a lot of agencies that have 5 members, so that the president's party has a majority, this one has 3 Republicans, 3 Democrats. And what it's supposed to do is it hears complaints. Campaigns or even private citizens can file them if they claim that someone's broken a campaign finance law. But what we have, and I was sort of put in the book, is we have a lot of examples of the staff inside the Federal Election Commission. And again, I think this is an ideology thing. They don't like money in politics either. They're just sort of naturally disinclined against it. It's not their job to have a statement on that or to rig the system in any way against money. We have the laws that we have, but you can tell they just generally don't like it. And I think it's true that because Republicans often embrace it, you see a little bit of a bias there. They don't like the Republican groups that have complaints filed against him. And that's what we have, and there's some stories of it in here of one Republican commissioner who was there for a while. He's gone now, Don McGahn, who managed to root out some pretty ugly examples of how the FEC staff was attempting to bring charges against groups, but only doing so in a way in which they'd had to juke the rules and sort of change things around so that these groups would be held to a different standard. And he exposed some of that, and it's a really interesting stories.
Yeah, in fact, it's said that lots of the lawyers who end up at the FEC are typical ruling class elites who view conservatives as backwoods simpletons who aren't smart enough to appreciate all the leftist progress can offer. And then you have McGahn saying, I'd love to say that what goes on is simple partisanship, a desire to get the right, but it's deeper than that. It's a way of thinking, and in some manner, that's far more troubling and a worrisome use of government power.
Yeah, those are all Don's words there, and I think he is on to something really important, because I think you see it in the IRS, and I think you see it in these agencies, and I think you see it in some of the other intimidation things that are in the book, this Wisconsin prosecution that went on. But what you have are these bureaucracies, and they are pre-programmed to dislike money in politics, to dislike Republicans. They kind of come to government all coming out of sometimes the same universities with the same viewpoints on things. And so when they hear the dog whistle, when they hear the President of the United States say these nonprofits are scary things, or when they're up in Wisconsin and they see a prosecutor working on a case against campaign finance violations supposedly by conservatives, they're primed to act. They're already ready and inclined to do it. And I think that that's how you end up with some of these abuses, that they're not as always out and out intentional, but you end up in the same place anyway.
So Kimberly, tell the story of Eric O'Keefe and the John Doe investigation in Wisconsin.
Yeah, this is in the book. I think the IRS scandal is really disturbing because of how broad it was, how wide, and how many Americans affected. Tens of thousands of Americans had their voices somewhat silenced during the 2010 and 2012 elections. Wisconsin is scary for the power and the abuse that was brought against these groups. So what you have is you have about 30 conservative grassroots organizations who were very supportive of Governor Scott Walker's government reforms during that whole recall fight that happened in Wisconsin. You then have a very liberal district attorney in Milwaukee who launches a secret probe into these groups. And he's able to do this because Wisconsin has a very odd law called the John Doe statute, which allowed you to conduct a secret investigation. So he issues these secret subpoenas to all of these organizations and individuals. He gets their internet, their email, he gets their phone records, he's going through their financial records, he's going through everything, he's tracking the connections they have with each other. He does pre-dawn raids. They show up in the dark at the house of some of the targets. I mean, this is happening in Wisconsin. One of the worst stories in the book is they show up at the house of one of the targets. He and his wife were on a charitable fundraising trip, and their teenage son is home alone. They come in, they put him in a room, they will not let him call an attorney, they will not let him call his grandparents who live down the road. They ransack the house, take things off, and then tell this kid as they leave, you are under a gag order. And if you tell anyone what happened to you here this morning, you can't even tell the school what happened to you, why you're late right now. If you tell anyone, you can go to jail. So, these are some of the tactics that were used. And by the way, I think the ending of this story is very important because Eric O'Keefe was one of those who was targeted in this, and he decided to defy this gag order. And he came to the Wall Street Journal where I worked, and we blew the lid off this abuse that was happening in Wisconsin, and it was plain out abuse. And then a lawsuit was filed, and it went all the way up to the Supreme Court in Wisconsin, and the Wisconsin Supreme Court shut down this probe. And at the end, there was this great line, and it's in the book, and I'm going to paraphrase here from what the court majority basically said, that the special prosecutor in this case, because at some point this was taken over from the DA by a special prosecutor, special prosecuting case has engaged in theories of law that don't exist in order to go after citizens who were entirely innocent of any wrongdoing. Which, think about that statement. That is, in essence, the Wisconsin Supreme Court saying, you abused your power. You harassed people, and you did it to send the message, this is what happens to you if you keep playing in elections. This is what you can expect. You'll have your homes raided. You'll have to hire attorneys. You'll have to spend tens of thousands of dollars in legal fees just because you decided to speak out.
It's honestly, it's such a stunning book, what you've put together, and it doesn't feel like America. It made me wonder as I drove here today, going by the museum that proudly puts the First Amendment on the outside of their building. At some point, we may have to put a black flag over that thing.
Yeah, it's a scary thing too, and I think Americans should know in the book as well. A lot of people might go, well, this is what happens to groups that play in the big boy league. You know, you go out and you're going to run ads in elections, or you're going to be engaged like the way the Tea Party was and go to demonstrations, or then maybe this is what happens. But this is happening to average Americans too, for the crime of having political beliefs. One of the, I think, another hugely disturbing story in this book happened out in California. And that was when a number of Californians donated money in favor of Prop 8, which was the ballot initiative in support of traditional marriage. Activists out in that state went and got a hold of the names and addresses of those who had donated in favor of it, and they put them on a searchable, walkable map. And you could go literally from neighborhood to neighborhood and see where your, quote, opponents lived. And the men and women who ended up on that list and on that map, they had their cars keyed, they had windows broken, they had very scary messages left on their internet, on their email and on their voicemail at home and at work. Some of them had flash mob protesters show outside of their small businesses and block the way so customers couldn't get in. Some of them lost their jobs. One of the most famous one was Brendan Eich of Mozilla, but there were many, many more besides who did as well too. And I think one of the scariest things about it is that a lot of these people gave depositions afterward about what had happened to them. And nearly all of them wrote at the end of their depositions something along the lines of, based on what just happened to me, I would be very reluctant to take part in another ballot initiative or another. So that's the point, is you intimidate people, you make their life so tough that they decide they're not going to engage in democracy anymore.
You hear both sides must do these tactics. What do you say when you hear people who aren't really engaged but just watch politics from afar say, yes, Kimberly, but that's both sides, Republicans and Democrats, everybody does this?
So, two things on that. The government abuse is largely one-sided. And I think there's a couple of reasons for that. Look, when I started this, I care about free speech and the First Amendment. I'm a bit of libertarian when it comes to this. And I don't think, I have no allegiance to one party or the other. And I went into this, I'd written a lot about the abuses on the left for my column in the Wall Street Journal, but I assumed going in that I was going to find a whole bunch of stuff on the right too. I didn't. There's a couple of examples, and they are in there. I put them in there. Back in 2004, the Bush administration, their IRS started to investigate a very liberal church out in California that on the eve of the re-election it appeared to have endorsed John Kerry, and suddenly the IRS was looking into this group, and that came out, and the blowback was huge, and they immediately backed off. But nothing like the IRS targeting scandal, in terms of...
You had a Democrat congressman lit that up too,
yes,
and went to GAO and got... there was rhetoric and intensity coming from the Democrats.
They were appalled that the IRS might be sicked on someone for political and partisan reasons, right. Not surprisingly. And by the way, I'm happy to say Republicans were too. And there was a bipartisan backlash to this, saying no, no, no. And so I think that's one reason why things immediately did back off. But I think that's part of it. You don't find it so much. And I think it's in part because conservatives do take very seriously, some of these constitutional values and believe that restraint ought to be part of their job. It's very interesting in response to all of this Exxon case we've seen lately, where you have these 20 attorneys general, liberal attorney generals, who are now suggesting they might bring racketeering charges against Exxon for the crime of not thinking the right way on the climate. And, on the grounds that supposedly they have issued in the past climate science that defrauds Exxon's investors. It was interesting. We had a group of Republican attorney generals who in response came out and said, could you imagine if we did this? I mean, we could essentially bring a fraud charge against a renewable energy company for claiming that it was saving the planet. Isn't it defrauding its own shareholders? Given the cost, given Solyndra, given, many of the things that have shown that the renewable energy sector has a lot of problems, it hasn't exactly saved the planet yet. So their argument being, we could do this, but we don't, because we don't think that it's an appropriate use of power. So I think that's one thing. I think you do see tactics that are used similarly, although not nearly as much by the right as on the left, as boycotts against businesses and sort of protests against businesses, but with one very big distinction. I think everyone should have the right to not use a service if they don't want to not buy a product if they don't want to, and that is often what the right does. They say, we're not going to buy Ben & Jerry's ice cream, or we're not going to. And that's one thing. The left, it's different because they have a demand that goes along with it. And their demand is, we're not going to stop harassing and intimidating you until you voluntarily give up your constitutional right to speak. And I do think that that is wrong. Everyone is given their constitutional rights. Corporations have a constitutional right to speak. And when the threats and the harassment and intimidation is about getting an organization to give up a constitutionally protected right, I think that is different in measure.
You're making me think of the story you tell on American Legislative Exchange Council, ALEC. They saw that a lot of corporations who were members of ALEC were blackmailed, it almost felt like. Say more.
Yeah, so what happened here is ALEC, American Legislative Exchange Council, they're a free market group. They develop model policy, and then they spread it throughout state legislatures, and they're very, very effective. They're supported in some part by corporate donations, but companies have an interest in seeing that there be kind of better business and regulatory environment in the states. Now, the left has long disliked ALEC, has campaigned against it for a long time, but when these new tactics came to be, they took a new approach. And what happened was ALEC, most of what it does is sort of economic-based model policy, but it did, to its peril, at one point decided to get involved and helped create these stand your ground laws that became very popular across the country. By the way, in Democratic and in Republican states. But when Trayvon Martin was shot in Florida and these issues became a law, they saw a new way to attack ALEC. And the groups claimed that ALEC was racist because it had helped develop these laws. And it claimed that any company went to every company, pretty much every major company that supported ALEC, and it said, by the way, if you continue to support ALEC, we will run ads saying that you are racist too. We will run ads in where you live. We will run ads against your board members. We will run ads in papers. We will make everybody understand that you support a racist organization. And ALEC lost half of its corporate donors, about half, in just the space of a few months.
You'd think that they'd argue out the ideas back and forth between the left and the right instead of put so much money and time into tactically destroying and pulling apart an organization. That's a little new.
Yeah, and I think it's really disturbing. Look, our Constitution, our founders, they said one reason that the First Amendment is first is because they believed that speech and debate was kind of the way to a flourishing democracy. And, they actually talk about this. They wanted to set faction against faction. And that's how they wanted this country to proceed. And so they liked the more voices, the better. And you go back in history, we've had some pretty ugly debates in this country too, but we debated it out. I don't know entirely what has caused this change. But I think some of it has to be, it seems to come from a frustration and an anger on the left that they can't just win the argument. And I think a good example of that is the climate discussion. Look, for 15 years, they've been trying to convince the American public that they really, the public really wants this very large and expensive regulatory system passed through Congress to deal with the climate issue. And they've never been able to sell the public on that. They've never had more than 40 votes in the Senate. And so instead, you see the president imposing this program by executive fiat through EPA regulations. You see Democratic senators sending harassing letters to the universities who continue to employ scientists who aren't on their line on climate, saying, you need to send us 10 years worth of all of your work with these scientists, harassing them, making it clear that their lives will be miserable if they continue to employ these professors. And of course, now you see these liberal attorneys generals going after Exxon, and along the way about another 100 conservative and free market think tanks that aren't towing the climate line. So you can't win the debate on your own. It's better to make the other people just go quiet.
Who is Bob Bauer?
Bob Bauer is a campaign finance expert, and he was also the general counsel for the Obama campaign in 2008 and 2012. And he pioneered some of these very rough tactics. Interestingly, the first time he did was actually against it was against Hillary Clinton, another Democrat. There was a super PAC who was supporting her in the 2008 primary. It was doing a lot for her, spending a lot of money in ads in different states, and the Obama team did not like this. Bob Bauer kind of ginned up a bunch of bogus campaign finance complaints, but then he did something that no one had really done before. Often these campaigns will complain against each other in the Federal Election Commission. He not only filed a complaint with the FEC, he tried to sic the Justice Department on this organization. He tried to sic the IRS on this organization. He held a public event with the press, and he threatened that not only was he going to get the Justice Department and IRS to go against the organization, but against their donors and against their officers. And he talked about criminal charges. And in the space of, couple weeks, the money to this organization dried up. And it was such an effective way of scaring people out of politics that he ended up using it, the team ended up using it against groups that supported John McCain in the general election. And then you began to see a lot of groups just in general replicate these tactics. There's a beginning for all of these things that are mentioned in the book.
So imagine if the victims were reversed, like it was the NAACP or Human Rights Campaign or Open Society or IPS or any of the left-wing groups. How do you think they would react if Republicans in power used these tactics against them? And how would the media react, and why might it be different?
Well, we know how they used to act. And I think that that's actually the great pity of this, is that you go back to the 1950s, it was the NAACP that brought this wonderful suit all the way up to the Supreme Court that ended up finding the court unanimously voted that there needed to be some anonymity in politics. Now, why did they? Because you had a case. NAACP was down in Alabama. You had an attorney general down there that wanted the state to continue with its Jim Crow laws. The NAACP had been a giant thorn in its side, had been involved in the Montgomery bus boycott and other things. So he filed this kind of bogus lawsuit against the NAACP that had to do with state incorporation. But in the process of that, demanded that the NAACP hand over to his office a list of all of its members in the states. And this was a period of lynchings. This was a period of people losing their jobs, of fire bombings, all kinds of terrible things happening to black Americans. And the NAACP understood that if they handed over that list, that it was like a hit list. And they fought it all the way up to the Supreme Court. So there are groups out there on the left who understand what it's like to be intimidated, or did, and fought against government officials that abuse that position. But I think that's been lost along the way. I don't know if it's in pursuit of power. I don't know if it's just a short memory. I don't know what it is, but everyone, like this book, again, this book ought to be someone that anyone should read, no matter what your political persuasions, because we have to care about the First Amendment and free speech. And this is aimed at, anyone who doesn't. The stories in here are disturbing, but every American should care about them.
Well, do you hear other liberal or Democrats speak out about it? I mean, I noticed that on the IRS at the beginning there was a lot of outrage expressed about the over-the-line tactics of the IRS. It's just that you're exposing that they were also involved in sending letters encouraging that same behavior. So they would say one thing but do another sometimes.
Oh, I believe that there's actually, like, the vast majority of Americans just love the First Amendment and could not, tolerate these sort of examples, would never do it themselves, and would come to the defense of anyone who was a target of those. I think that this gets to the power structure. That's who's perpetrating this, okay? It's the people who are playing at the top, the elected officials, the elected Democrats, and I think they've lost sight of, what actually matters, and it's all about winning. And I think you see that in some of the big groups that operate, the activist groups that operate out there too. It's just about winning at all costs. And the reason I'm hopeful that that is not the view felt by most Americans is that, for instance, as part of that whole ALEC debate we were talking about, another thing that happened was Senator Dick Durbin, he's a senator from Illinois, even as these groups were attacking all of these companies as being, racist and trying to push them out of, he launched a kind of twin campaign. He sent a letter out to about 1,000 organizations in the country demanding to know if they supported ALEC, and then suggesting that if they did, he might haul them in front of Congress for a hearing. And by the way, he should never have even asked for this information because ALEC's donor information is in theory protected by law. But when this came out that he had done this, it was wonderful to see. In his home state, the outrage was huge. Even many of the left-leaning papers in the state said, had headlines that said things like Durbin's enemies list, and no, you do not get to do this. You hold a very powerful position, and you don't get to use that to try to scare people out of, supporting nonprofit groups. You just don't get to do it. And he was so abashed, he never did hold that hearing. Well, he held a hearing, and then he never actually talked about the subject at hand again.
So why do you think there hasn't been blowback on President Obama? And compared to Richard Nixon's potential use of the IRS, what would be the Obama legacy, do you think?
Well, one thing I think that, needs to be pointed out is that, we don't have any evidence that the president picked up a telephone and told the IRS to do this. There is no evidence of that. My argument in the book is that he didn't really need a telephone. He had a megaphone. He went out there and day in and day out and said these groups were bad and brought attention to it and sort of primed the bureaucracy to act in that regard. I think in terms of the IRS, it's a little depressing because no one's been held accountable. And I really believe that one reason that is because our press too often doesn't stick with stories anymore. The line that the White House put out at the very beginning was a couple of agents, Cincinnati, didn't know the law. Investigations take a long time. So by the time Congress had actually got through all of this, and we know that that's not what happened, no one had much interest in following that story anymore. And as a result, most of the public doesn't know, and they haven't, as a result, like President hasn't had to hold anyone to account and has not been held to account himself.
Is that because the media is changing too? Because you think back to Ben Bradley at the Washington Post with Woodward and Bernstein, they wouldn't have let it go. It would have been headline, and they would have found things that kept the story moving. And you watch the president's poll numbers go down until the end on Nixon. And it's just a different media, it feels like, Kim.
Yeah, it is. Now, and there are some shining examples. The Wall Street Journal, where I work, I've been very proud, not just what the editorial page has done, but the news side has been very unrelenting on stories about, for instance, like Hillary Clinton's emails, her servers, what happened in that sort of instance. So there are some stories that do continue to go. But I think, it's a different media. It's one in which, people don't sit down and read a newspaper from front to back anymore. Not a lot of people do. A lot of people, they read what gets tweeted to them. Or what that gets posted on Facebook, and it just simply is the case that the media is always looking for a way to be that flashy story that gets tweeted, to be that thing, and I think it's such a daily preoccupation that sometimes the longer stuff just doesn't. They cannot keep focus on it.
Well, I noticed that your title, The Intimidation Game, it might feel like a game if you're the one that has the power, that's manipulating and picking your targets. But if you're the target, if you're the victim, it doesn't feel like a game. It feels like hell, probably, to have the government up against you, or reputational warfare. So why the book title?
So, I mean, it was just in part, like, intimidation is what this is, and it just summed it up very well. And then, of course, the rest of it was, a basis of that movie, The Imitation Game. So, but intimidation is what we are talking about here.
So what was it like to write your very first book?
It was fun. I've always wanted to write a book since I was a little kid. And I did. I had my name on a prior book, but that was just because of the generosity of two wonderful scholars. They'd asked me to help ghostwrite a book on women and economic policies. And when I got done, they were gracious enough to put my name on as sort of co-author. But it was never really my book. And this was my book. And it was fun. It was hard work. I have 3 young kids. And I didn't take a book break to do this. I didn't take a work break to do this. So I wrote it every night from like 8:30 at night till midnight or 1 in the morning. And I did that for months and months and months. So I was very happy when it was done. But it feels very nice to see it out now, too.
You said in the end one of your kids was keeping track of how many days until he got his mom back?
Yeah, no, my kids, they're the heroes of this book because they put up with Mom while she did all of this. And yes, my oldest son, who is now 11, he was 10 at the time, very helpfully. Every morning we have a dry erase board on the refrigerator, and we'll come down and cross out and say 23 more days till deadline. 22 until we actually got to the last day. It was like 7 hours till deadline. And the stress of that every morning, at least it did keep me going just so that I could say I got it done.
So what made you pick this topic, and what made you tell these stories? And were there stories you had to edit out of this big book already?
Yeah, so I've been down in Washington for about 10 years covering politics down here. And starting with the beginning of the Obama administration, that this is a very hard-knuckle political administration. They use a lot of tactics that I hadn't seen before. And I started writing about those more and more in the column. And I think that naturally led me to a lot of the places that are in this book. It wasn't until a couple of years ago, I'd written about each of these sort of episodes individually, that I actually started to do some more reporting, and I realized that they were linked. They were the same, not all the time, but there were people who were sort of replicating, they were talking to each other, using the same tactics again and again, and I realized, and I went back and looked at what had happened after Citizens United and saw the discussions there and realized that these were not all random, that there had been some thought put into what was going on here. And so that was sort of it, to try to wrap it together, to try to give people an idea of how it began and how widespread it is now.
Well, you hope that there's checks and balances in the system that would keep a rogue agency or a rogue government official from exerting too much power. So what are the checks and balances, and why don't they seem to be working?
Yeah, in some cases, I think this is a real shame because politics has gotten in the way of accountability. Lois Lerner retired with full benefits. She's never been held to account. The House ended up holding her in contempt, voted to it, sent it off to a federal prosecutor. His job under the statute was to convene a grand jury. In the end, he waited until his last day in the office and sent a letter back saying, I'm just not going to do it, and then retired. So, it's hard to get or up in Wisconsin, and I think one reason why not too is people, I don't know why no one has been held account in Wisconsin. What happened up there was absolutely appalling, and yet far from expressing any contrition, the special prosecutor is threatening to take this all the way to the Supreme Court. So they're not embarrassed by the tactics.
Well, tell the story about Catherine Engelbrecht.
Yeah, this is another one where, again, we were talking about the bureaucracy and how when you're the president, you need to be careful. When you're elected Democrat, anyone in office, elected officers need to realize that they have immense power and that this bureaucracy listens to what they say and that they can do bad things to people as a result. So Catherine Engelbrecht runs an organization called True the Vote. And True the Vote is one of those voter integrity projects that looks at electoral rolls, try to make sure that the electoral rolls are clean, that people are voting, that really do have the right to vote. And, people on the left hate those groups, and they hate a lot of these election reform laws that have been passed out in the states. Really viciously hated. Eric Holder, when he was the Attorney General, he launched a big campaign against these laws and suggested that they were violating rights just even by being on the books. So Catherine Engelbrecht very early became a target. She also happened to be, by the way, one of the nonprofits. And she became a target. Many elected Democrats who singled her out, used her name, went after her, and by and large, hers was one of the nonprofits that couldn't get IRS status and got targeted. But she suddenly also, in her place of her home business, started getting visits from the IRS, from other agencies in the federal government, until the list was quite extraordinarily long, and it had all happened in the space of about a year. And I talked to her in this book, and she sort of said, it's one of those things you don't even understand what's happening at first, and then when you begin to realize, you're like, maybe I'm just crazy. And she said she remembered going to talk to her lawyer and saying, I don't want to sound like I'm someone who believes in black helicopters, but all this, do you think this sounds weird? And the lawyer was like, Catherine, this is terrible. This is targeting. Someone is coming after you, and it's a bureaucracy that has been listening, and or you're on a list. Something has happened, but there is no way that just coincidentally that many federal and state agencies come and visit you all in the course of a few months after you happen to start a very controversial organization.
And you talked to people like Cleta Mitchell and other Jay Sekulow and others who have tried to help and be there for a lot of the victims that you're talking about in your book. What did they say to you, and how do we get to the bottom of it? Yeah, no,
Cleta and Jay are both heroes. One thing that was nice about this book is I did not set out to do it this way, but it sort of became, in telling the stories of these people who were targeted. And by the way, I'm very careful never to call them victims, because they do not see themselves as victims. And one of the reasons they're not is because they spoke out. When they ended up getting targeted and when they ended up having intimidation tactics used against them, they said something. And so there's a lot of free speech heroes that are profiled in this book, and Cleta and Jay are among them. And they, this is a good example. They are attempting to hold some people accountable. Some of these outside lawyers have continued to pursue lawsuits against the IRS. We have recently had, it's been great, the Sixth Circuit is requiring the IRS to turn over a bunch of documents that it had otherwise managed to successfully sit on for 3 years, because it still keeps stonewalling things. So, thank goodness we do have these lawyers out there who take on these cases, because while we're not getting any accountability from government, and while, Congress has tried to impose some accountability and been thwarted by, district attorneys and other things, what we are getting is these outside lawyers who are forcing the courts to look at this. And the courts, it's been, some of their rulings have been amazing in that they have expressed complete disbelief and incredulity that the IRS has continued to stonewall even after the fact.
You hear about dark money from the left, and you hear about Charles Koch and David Koch. Who are some of the dark money people on the left that we probably don't hear about?
Oh, there are all kinds. People talk about George Soros and the money that he gives to groups. Look, I think this is important to point out. Again, this is how the people at the top, they use issues like this, even though they don't, they use it. It's all about winning. It's all about power. You need to understand that the people who complain loudest about dark money and too much money in politics are the people that use vast amounts of money and dark money in politics, okay? You hear all these guys at the top on the left complaining about the Koch brothers and the fact that the Kochs give money to groups like Americans for Prosperity, which is a grassroots organization, by the way. But you never hear them talk about Tom Steyer, who's this billionaire environmentalist who spent tens of millions of dollars in the last midterm trying to make sure that Democrats won the Senate, which they didn't do. But, that they're not complaining about him. They're not saying, please don't give us your money. We don't believe in that. Of course they're not. They're using this, I think, because, again, it is about winning. if you can convince people that there's dark money out there, and you can convince them that you need these campaign finance rules as a result, then you can once again control speech. Like I said, they had come to rely on that, on making sure that corporations couldn't play in elections, and putting restrictions on nonprofits from playing in elections, and they don't really want to have all those voices out there. And I think that should scare people a lot about what the real motives are. By the way, on dark money, I think this is just to give you an idea of how they misuse this, okay? In 2012, we spent about $7 billion on federal elections. And that may sound like a lot of money to people, but just to put it in perspective, we spend $7 billion every year on Halloween. Okay, so it's probably worth at least that much to have a representative democracy. I would actually argue more would probably be better. That people, if they could care more about spending on elections than Halloween, that would probably be good for society. But of that $7 billion, approximately 3 to 4% of it is what the left calls dark money. 3 to 4%. It's a couple $100 million a year. Okay, it's the vast majority, 96%, 97% of all money in elections is already disclosed. And of that 3 to 4%, they call it dark money. I call it protected money, because that's often the smaller donors who are giving money to a nonprofit who really are worried about someone coming to get them. These are the people who give money to social welfare organizations and other kind of things, or might even be controversial organizations on the left, even, by the way, where people just don't feel comfortable having their name out there on a financial disclosure form. So we give some protection for that.
It looks like we have about 16 minutes left in our conversation. This is really great. There's other people on the left who give money, whether it's the Democracy Alliance is set up in a way that helps all the big money people on the left focus in on what the big messages or issues are. And I don't necessarily see that happening. Maybe it does on the right. But foundations, Ford Foundation, Rockefeller Foundation, ARCA Foundation, say more.
Yeah, no, I mean, what the organization you just mentioned, it's a very clever setup. What they do is they kind of steer donors in the direction of activist groups that they feel need money. And Democracy Alliance is very successful in that way. But again, that is a lot of money often going to social welfare groups on the left, and you don't always hear them complain so much about dark money there, for instance. This is a way, again, of having an issue, excuse me, that they can talk about to sort of push forward a campaign finance agenda. And what I call them speech laws. A lot of people wouldn't agree with that, but money is a proxy for speech. And I know that that's an unpopular thing to say today, but just to make it a really easy sort of way of putting it forward. If you said you wanted to run for the presidency, and I said, that sounds great, but you can only have $50 to do it. I think that both of us could probably agree that you weren't going to be very effective at getting your message out to 300 million Americans, okay? So if you accepted that premise, that obviously money does enable speech to a certain degree, then the converse is also true. If you're going to put limits on money, then you're going to limit speech to a certain degree at the end. But the people that are out there, again, ask yourself, so why do they want to limit money? You want to limit speech. And I think it's notable and very scary to me that we have both Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders were out in the political races here, both of them running with a top campaign promise that if they were elected, that they would seek to alter the First Amendment and again give government the ability to say who shouldn't be allowed to talk in elections. Okay, I can't remember a presidential contender running on a promise of changing the Bill of Rights, and in a way that, by the way, minimizes our rights rather than expands them. But this is the degree to which those who want to win at this point are willing to trample on some of our constitutional rights in order to silence people that they don't agree with.
You raise such a good point. In your book, you talk about, you kind of walk back from the Keating Five to McCain and how John McCain gets, it seems as if he's manipulated into by a whole, the rhetoric and the narratives that are built up about corruption. Yeah. There's this whole game, your point, using narratives that is orchestrated across the whole movement on one side of the equation. They're better at it on the left, and they do it from the president down through their activist groups to their people on the Hill, and they build a perception of something that may or may not be true, but then they pass legislation. So talk about McCain-Feingold and how you would know more than most. The power in politics used to be in the parties, but it's now kind of sucked into the shadow government types. Places.
Yeah, and you don't even have to start with McCain-Feingold. You know, I think the American Republicans in some way had a big scam placed on them. Everyone has come to believe that campaign finance laws are kind of, you know, the answer to clean elections. And there's no question that some amount of disclosure is required to know what's going on out there. But the restrictions, it's a different thing. And the money restrictions, what I think most people don't realize is that the politicians do not pass these laws in order to make themselves more accountable. They pass these laws because in the whole history, there's only a couple of reasons why campaign finance laws have ever been passed. One is because Washington gets caught in a scandal and it feels it needs to kind of make up for it, and so it passes these things to sort of look as though it's taking action. But the other reason is they're used as an excuse for one side to block out their opponents. And both sides have done that terribly over the years. You know, the Republicans have passed laws to sort of block unions from speaking in elections. The Democrats have passed laws to keep corporations from speaking in elections. You can go all the way back. I mean, a great example is one of the first big campaign finance laws we ever had. It was called the Tillman Act. And Teddy Roosevelt is running for election, and he gets all of these giant companies or rather I should say very wealthy businessmen, you know, to support him. A lot of the trust owners at the time to support him in this thing, and he wins. And the Democrats are furious. Now, they happen to have run a bad candidate, and that's really why they lost. But they make a big fuss about all the corporate money and backing he had. And Teddy Roosevelt, who's now under assault for all of this, and who, by the way, decided that he really wanted to make a big campaign issue out about trust busting anyway, decides to turn around and go, yeah, no one should ever be allowed to do what I just did again. And helps the Democrats, you know, so makes himself look like a hero in this. Also, you know, sets the people he now wants to go target in his administration up to have to be silent in future elections. He's not running for re-election himself again. It was utterly self-serving, and yet it was sort of, you know, sold to the American public as, look, we're gonna keep people honest in elections. And that theme runs all the way up through the campaign finance laws we have today. And what they largely do is they keep incumbents in power, because who has megaphones already? They do. Money is what enables challengers to come up to them and speak up against them. You know, as we know too, some of the other aspects of this, like disclosure laws, politicians have become very good at avoiding disclosure laws themselves. And the disclosure is now being focused on Americans who end up on lists like out in California.
Mm. Well, we have about 5 minutes left to go. If you're the target of one of these efforts, give your advice to ordinary citizens or corporations or donors. What do you do if you're under attack and you get swarmed by the left, or if you have suddenly a lot of visits from the IRS or FBI or ATF or alphabet soup agencies?
Yeah, well, first of all, you have to know what's happening. You know, and that's one reason why I wrote the book, to let people know what's going on, so that if they see it themselves. One thing that was quite disturbing reporting it was the number of people I talked to who didn't for a while know what was going on, or they thought that maybe they were crazy. So people need to know that there is abuses happening by the hands of government officials to average citizens, and that you could be one of those. So just to be aware. But then the next thing you do is you speak out, you tell your story. And, you know, if you have activists who are coming to you and say you need to be quiet, the best thing you can absolutely do is tell them to go pound sand. Because, you know, that's what I discovered in the book, is the corporations in particular who rolled over to the first of their demands, would just get teed up again to have to roll over, to get hit again, and then they'd roll over to the second set of demands, and then they'd get hit again. Whereas the companies who said, we are not going down this road, and you can send all the letters you want and run the ads that you want, we believe in what we do, we're standing up for ourselves, I will tell you why we did this, they got left alone. I think that's a lesson for a lot of Americans, corporations in particular. They have not been brave enough about embracing the constitutional rights that the court very bravely gave them. They do have a constitutional right to speak in elections, and we should be glad that they do, because they represent millions of Americans who they employ, because they promote policies and have an interest in policies that limited government, regulatory reform, lower taxes, a lot of the things that are good for economies and good for the shareholders and good for people. So they have a stake in this. But they've been kind of weenie about it. And they tend to step back and let other people defend them for them. And then they get subject to these attacks.
And businesses and corporations are one thing, but as you write, Tea Party activists, patriots who just decided to do a little bit more to save the country on top of their regular jobs, out of their garages or basements or church halls, they don't have resources, Kim. So you need resources to have the sustenance and the wherewithal to go up against these guys. What can they do if they don't have resources?
Well, I think increasingly there are networks. One thing that was neat, there is a kind of an umbrella Tea Party organization, Tea Party Patriots. They were targeted as well. But they had the ability to offer some legal advice to a lot of these groups and things. Look around, there are in fact a lot of organizations that do support free speech, in Washington and around the country as well too. And they try to bring to light abuses like this when they hear them. Sometimes they file lawsuits on behalf of people who've had their constitutional rights violated. And you can go online and put in some things, throw in free speech into Google and defense of free speech, and you will come up with some resources. So always remember that you are not alone, too, if this happens to you.
So looking down the road in the last minute or so, are you optimistic about where we're going? Is there a trend to fight back on this free speech infringement?
I'm very worried about the tactics because they've gotten worse over time, but I am optimistic that more and more people kind of understand what some of those are and are fighting back against it. Like some of the think tanks that were hit alongside this Exxon probe have just been magnificent. One of them turned around and countersued one of the, the attorney generals in this, and as a result, the subpoena has been withdrawn. So people are getting wise to some of this.
It's been so great. Thank you for what you've done. I'm looking forward to your next book.
Thank you, and thanks for the great questions.
C-SPAN, created by America's cable television companies and brought to you as a public service by your cable or satellite provider.
And I tell a story in Life Equity about being out campaigning. I'd been in the state Senate, and now I was campaigning for Congress. And no one in Tennessee had ever, on their own, put their name on the ballot, gone out, run, won their race. I was the first woman elected in her own right. We had had 4 women who had followed a spouse. And I was in a county that had a little, what we call a meat and 3, a little cafe. Your plate is 1 meat and 3 veggies. So we call them meat and 3s. And I had gone in this county. They didn't have many women that served in elective office. And so I was passing out my campaign material. And I went over to this gentleman that you could tell had been out farming, and handed him my card. And I said, "Hi, I'm State Senator Marsha Blackburn. I'm running for Congress, and I sure would appreciate having your vote." So he looked at me and he said, "Little lady, what qualifies you?" Now that's a giveaway. You know you're not going to get the vote being called little lady. "What qualifies you for the U.S. House of Representatives?" And I thought, well, you know, I've been the 3-year-old choir director, the room mother chairman, and the Girl Scout cookie mom. So I think I probably could handle the U.S. House of Representatives because I've handled those jobs. Now bear in mind, he didn't want to talk about that I was a state senator and just had led a 4-year fight to keep us state income tax free. You know, that didn't go. So I kind of threw that at him, and I thought, you know, those jobs of being the 3-year-old choir director and the room mother chairman and the Girl Scout cookie mom, those are true life skills that do prepare you for working with people, with working with diverse groups of people, and with being able to help lead